everybody, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 11th, 2019, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. So this week, we have a chat with Dr. Lydia Pyne all about her new book, Genuine Fakes. But before we dive into that, I want to thank those of you who have made Talk Nerdy possible this week. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download, and that's because I rely on the support from listeners just like you. If you want to pledge your support for the show, all you've got to do is go to patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can learn all about how to help out. The top supporters this week include Ulrika Hagman, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Dudas Infinitas, Phil T-Bear, The Zombie Drummer, David J. E. Smith, Brian Holden, and of course, Jeffrey Sewell. Thank you all so very much. All right, guys, this week is a really great show because it is a guest that I had on actually 3 years ago, almost to the day, which is fascinating. She first came on to talk about her book, 7 Skeletons, but this time she talks about her brand new book, Genuine Fakes: How Phony Things Teach Us About Real Life. Dr. Lydia Pyne is a writer and a historian. She's actually interested in the history of science and material culture. Her degrees are in history and anthropology, and she has a PhD in history and philosophy of science from Arizona State University. She has written for so many different amazing outlets, and she's currently a visiting researcher at the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. So guys, without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Lydia Pyne. Well, Lydia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's wonderful.
I'm so excited to be able to talk. I don't get to do this very often, like reconnect with somebody who was on the show literally years ago, because they have something completely new that we get to talk about. So I'm super excited that we are able to reconnect this morning.
Yes, it feels like a really fun segue from a couple of different kinds of conversations here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, we met. I want to look up actually our last episode. So let me think about this. So that would be, I know
I think
how
it
to
should be
check my
around
URLs.
2016, maybe?
2016, that probably sounds about
Yeah.
right. Let's see the actual date that it aired. Hopefully that was pretty soon after we recorded it. Yep, October 31st, Halloween 2016.
Oh, brilliant.
Wow.
Wow,
Yeah, so
that's fantastic.
oh, I know. It's like almost to the day. Wow, 3 whole years. So when you were first on the show, we were talking about your new book then, 7 Skeletons: The Evolution of the World's Most Famous Human Fossils. And that was because we had previously met just very recently at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles. Did we do a panel together?
We did a book conversation together, and it was in front of all of those awesome dioramas, and it was super cool. And we had a chance to talk sort of all things human evolution and fossils.
That was so fun because that was like a one-on-one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you were introducing us sort of to all these different fossils that, many of which we already knew and loved, some of which were probably new to some of the people in the audience. We especially talked about Lucy or Tong Child, or all these different kind of hominid fossils that individuals, I think, had some sort of like kind of personal connection with. But of course, in having that conversation, we also talked about Piltdown Man.
Yes. And Piltdown Man, if I'm honest, so Piltdown Man is this fantastic story of this hoax that's one of the longest perpetrated hoaxes in the history of science. It's a less than genuine, as in not real at all, fossil species. But what I became so intrigued with when I was doing the research for 7 Skeletons was you have this fake fossil species, but the fossil itself, Piltdown itself, if I go to the museum in London and look at the Piltdown pieces, they're real pieces. They're real bits of bone. And I was left with this idea of, does having real bits and pieces of something help sort of sell a fake in a way that being completely fake doesn't? And so I think that was really sort of the first foray into exploring the themes and the topics in Genuine Fakes. We could trace it back to Piltdown Man there.
I love that. I kind of had a hunch because Piltdown Man was like this interesting one-off within 7 skeletons. Like the other 6 skeletons, of course, are genuine hominid skeletons.
Right.
And then
Right.
Piltdown was this really complicated, really fascinating story that we actually, on the other podcast I work on, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, have covered several times and are really
Oh, perfect.
into, right? Because we
Right.
are a skeptic podcast, and the whole thing is about kind of how to use skeptical skills to be able to determine the difference between what's genuine and what's not. Like, actually, our subhead of the book that we co-wrote last year, The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, how to tell what's really real in a world increasingly full of fake. So it's so great to have you on this show to talk about your new book, Genuine Fakes, How Phony Things Teach Us About Real Stuff, because it's sort of the flip side of that phenomenon.
Right. And I was so excited when your guys' book came out, because I felt like it was really speaking to this desire for people to want to connect with authenticity and to think about what makes something authentic and how that can change over time. And so I feel like that we're sort of looking at this sort of both sides of the coin here.
Absolutely. It's such a, I think, obviously timely, obviously super important conversation to be having because of the political climate, just because the word fake has been used sort of as ammunition so often, right? Like when we think about fake news as an actual construct, there has always been fake news. There's always been propaganda. Ever since we look at like the earliest elections, we can see propaganda within the newspapers and people like slinging mud and lies and things like that. But that's not the way that the president right now uses the term fake news. He uses it more as a way to stop the conversation, a way to say, I don't want to talk about this any further. I'm going to call that fake news. So it's a non-starter.
Exactly. And I think that sort of looking at how we use the word fake, and that we use it as a label, as a dismissal, a judgment, and sort of all of the ways that fake can almost be weaponized linguistically. I wanted to unpack that and to sort of call attention to the idea that fake can mean a lot of different things, and that there isn't a sort of inherent moralism that's caught up in the word fake, the way I think that fake news has become the sort of moral judgment or the sort of non-starter. And so that's what I would really hope folks would be interested in, is looking at how fake and authenticity can change over time.
Yeah, and so much of it has to do, I guess, with kind of just human perception and where our boundaries really lie and where those kind of definitional edges are for us. Because you're right, like there's no intrinsic value. There's no kind of fundamentally easy line that says on that side of the line something is authentic or real, and on this side of the line something is um inauthentic or quote unquote fake. I mean, I think there are extreme examples. You can fabricate things, you
Right.
can lie, you can, yeah, like we said, sling mud or propaganda. But then there are kind of examples where, from a philosophical perspective, that line is a little wiggly, isn't it?
Yeah, and so I think that there are definitely the examples where fakes are problematic. They have this element of fraud or this element of deception, or there's some kind of trickery that's involved with it. But it's also interesting to look at, sort of in the material life of an object, how much that can change and how much the historical circumstances plays a role in that. And one of the really fun examples that I was able to dive into was what happens to fake art after it's debunked. Okay, we
Mm.
have this forged painting and it's not a, quote unquote, real painting, but what happens to it afterwards? And that question, I felt like, really helped me understand how authenticity could be fluid and could be very dynamic. And it turns out there's a lot of fake art that is collectible even after it's been debunked. And that was a really cool sort of inversion of how I think about authenticity.
Oh, that's fascinating. And I mean, I would assume, but maybe I'm wrong, that the more kind of media attention or the bigger the story around the art being fake, or the closer to the original, or, for whatever reason, the more collectible it might become. Like, what reasons would somebody want to collect something that we know and have the record, like actual paperwork to show isn't a real Warhol, for example, or isn't a real Basquiat or whatever?
Right. And so there's sort of, because there are a couple of different reasons I think that come to mind in answering your question. One is, I mean, really, why does anybody collect anything? And so, you sort of have this like, oh, I could collect these fakes. And there are brilliant, in-depth, well-provenient, genuine fakes that are put together into brilliant art collections. And then the other way to look at it, I think, is to look at it as part of the story that sort of makes its cultural provenance. That it's not just, who painted what when, but it's all of the story that kind of goes into it. And so, for example, there's one forger that I talk about in the book, William Henry Ireland, who in the 18th century is busy cranking out these really hilarious Shakespeare forgeries. And sort of anywhere and everywhere that you would expect to see Shakespeare's signature show up, William Henry Ireland ensures that it does. And he only sort of has 18 months of his go as a forger until he's sort of unmasked as this fraud. And he sort of slinks off into the pages of history. But then decades later, William Henry Ireland runs into money trouble. And so he starts faking and starts forging the original forgeries that he had created and selling them as, oh, these were my original forgeries. And I love the recursiveness of this, that not only were you a forger, but here you are forging your forgeries. And that here, if we fast forward to the 21st century, William Henry Ireland forgeries are some of the most collectible for Shakespearean forgeries.
It's so weird. It also really makes me wonder, like, why, what a career path. Like, why do people choose, I'm going to be a professional forger? And maybe that's never how they see themselves, right? It's like how we historically label them after the fact, sort of a post hoc, like we said, judgment. But during the time, like, what is the motivation, right?
For William Henry Ireland, it's pretty clear that he is desperately seeking the approval of his father, that his father is this sort of, it's really kind of a sad story once you unpack it at that level, but his father is sort of this middling collector of rare books and stuff. And William Henry Ireland is desperate to impress him, and his dad sort of thinks that he's a dolt, and so is not really going to have anything to do with him. And so once William Henry Ireland, is able to produce these brilliant Shakespeare finds, then his father, thinks that he's great. And so it sort of has, I think, the sort of thematic sense of looking for approval, maybe. And maybe that's one of the things that that unites a lot of fakery and forgery. But there is this sort of element in the Ireland story of the desperate seeking of approval.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like there's probably, and you, of course, dug into this for a long time, doing your historical work, reading up on these different issues for the book, and then, of course, organizing your thoughts and figuring out which stories you wanted to tell, how you wanted to chapter them out. But it does feel like there's this sort of analogy you can draw between fake things and deception or lying. And when we really start to try and unpack the psychology of deception, one of the underlying themes there is definitely approval. If I tell this lie, then I'm getting out of trouble. Or if I tell this lie, then I can validate or justify my behavior. And then it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, especially when more and more people are giving you positive feedback for the lie or the deception.
Yeah. And then at the end of it, here you have a collection of deeds, with Shakespeare's name and a new play and all of this. This is sort of the end point, right, of the looking for approval there.
And do you feel like this is a theme that you see throughout you did a really good job, I think, of ensuring that the different kind of chapters that you developed throughout the book are like wildly different from each other. So I'm wondering, is there any sort of thematic stuff that you feel like really does hold water throughout the entire world of fakes?
Right. And I would say yes, that there is. So in the book, we have laboratory grown diamonds, and we have wildlife documentaries, and we have William Henry Ireland and stories of the Spanish forger, and all of these sorts of different things that I think on the surface, you look at this and just say, what on earth could possibly unite this? What is the common underlying theme? And I would say that for myself, what I've found diving into all of these different stories is that authenticity exists as a continuum, and that each of these different objects have moved up and down that continuum of authenticity throughout their history. And one of the things that the project really encouraged me to stop doing was to stop thinking about authenticity as something that was static, but to start thinking about it as dynamic, and to look at its context to understand the object itself.
Oh, that's such an interesting way. So really it's about the kind of change over time and how that occurs. It's funny because coming from a psychological perspective, one of the things that's been changing with regards to my view of sort of the classic, I guess, logical positivist view, which I've
Right.
historically always subscribed to, right, as a scientist and as somebody
Yeah.
who studied a lot of philosophy in school. But now that I'm more in clinical psychology and I'm working with people and patients and their own sort of realities, I'm much more of, or at least maybe I should say, I'm much more sensitive to and understanding of the constructivist view, which is basically that, like, it doesn't matter if something is objectively real. If it's not real to a person, it's not real to that person. And so, like, we do construct our own realities. So it's like, not only is realness or
Mhm.
fakeness a function of time and change, it's not static, it's also a function of perspective.
Yeah, and then you throw in on top of that, particularly since we're talking about material objects here, then you sort of throw on top of that the question of materiality. And what is going into making this less than genuine thing, or this copy, a copy or a replica or a facsimile, or all of the ways that something is not the original, and all of the ways of sort of making meaning that go into that.
Oh my gosh, it's so much more complicated than it seems like it would be on its surface.
Yes, there were some days working on this project, I was just left going, "Oh my goodness, what's real?" And it was very existentially like fraught at the end of it.
I love that though. That's everything I love. I'm actually studying right now to become an existential psychologist, which sounds like a fake job, but it's totally
No,
real.
it is a
And I
genuine
love
job, and that's awesome.
and I love it so much. So, okay, one of the stories, obviously, there's so many great stories in your book that I
Mhm.
would love to dive into, but one of the things that you grapple with and you talk about is, as you mentioned a minute ago, nature documentaries. And
Yeah.
this is something that is really interesting to me because I had several years ago, also on the show, a really fascinating woman named Jo Ruxton. And Jo is a producer, a film producer, and she came on after working on Blue Planet. And then immediately after that, she had this sort of, I wouldn't maybe call it a crisis of consciousness. Like, I think she was very proud of the work that she did on Blue Planet. But as she told the story on my podcast, and I highly recommend everybody go back to that episode to listen, she was saying, listen, like, the oceans don't look the way that they do in these documentaries. Like, we would spend hours and hours filming just to find these pristine shots because most of them had garbage in them. Most of them were full of like detritus, like there was just crap everywhere. And then these really gorgeous, pristine shots are actually few and far between. And she really grappled with this idea of, do we present something as aspirational, or do we present something as maybe a little bit more quote unquote real, knowing that it's a different kind of story? And so after she worked on Blue Planet, she actually worked to develop her own doc called A Plastic Ocean to really shine a light on those issues. But in her mind, and I think probably in the minds of the networks and the people who commissioned Blue Planet, those had to be two separate documentaries.
Right, right.
And so it is an interesting concept, right?
It really gets into this question of what is the story, I think, that the documentary is trying to tell. That there's a sense that the documentary is presenting information to its audience. And the question is then sort of, what information is it presenting and how does it do that? And one of the things that was so interesting to juxtapose in the chapter with that was looking at these sort of blockbuster scripted documentaries like Blue Planet that have these, spectacular stories and these spectacular shots, and to juxtapose that with a nature cam that's simply being live streamed from wherever it's set up, whether it's the bear cam or walrus cam or something like that, and to really look at how these two different ways of watching nature both were real, but also left out different parts, and sort of that there are different things that can be highlighted through scripted and unscripted ways of watching nature. And that was really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, so what are some of the ways, I guess, the kind of purest examples, quote unquote, of how a nature documentary might make people say, wait, if once they knew kind of how the sausage was made, might say, wait, that's not quote unquote real.
I think in some ways it's the pace that gets sped up in a nature documentary that if you sort of sit there and watch a nature cam, there's going to be a lot of downtime. There's going to be a lot of, the animal isn't, it's just kind of doing its thing. Like I spent a lot of time watching walrus cam in the name of research for this book. And so I would just sit there and I would be mesmerized. I mean, it was fascinating, but it wasn't necessarily a story that was moving along. We weren't learning about walrus, migration or, social dynamics or anything like that. I was watching walruses sort of hit each other with their flippers and, sort of what, and trying to sort of say, okay, what's happening? What am I seeing? And the Alaska Game and Fish, I should point out, has a great sort of Q&A that you can go sort of trawl through and have a lot of these questions answered, but it's not being narrated, and you're not being sort of guided through the experience the way you are guided through something like Blue Planet.
Yeah, so that's part of it too. It's like, it's funny that the real maybe feels more fake, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
because we're so used to living in a media kind of culture that's actually not the real way. Like, it's kind of like the story of what would our lives be like if we all had our own soundtracks, like when we walk into different, rooms, and it's like womp womp, or like it's like happy shopping music. Like, it would be a totally different experience.
Right. No, I remember at one point I was looking back through a couple of weeks ago, I was looking back through some of the notes that I took in putting together that chapter about the wildlife documentaries. And I look back and I had named 3 of the walruses that I was watching. Like, I think I named them Brad, Thad, and Chad, and just, would make up these little stories about the walruses. And at that point, I've completely anthropomorphized nature. I've completely, sort of put this story that's not about walruses. It's about me looking at walruses. And it felt like it was a really great way to juxtapose sort of, I'm not learning anything more about walruses than I would, just without sort of having that scripted nature documentary to guide me through it.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting that, that kind of layer of human sort of intervention can sometimes, I don't know, while it itself is maybe a fakeification of something that's real, it feels more like a realification of something that's fake.
Yes.
One of the things that you talk about on the in the book is like quote unquote natural flavors and artificial flavors, and just the whole construct within our food system of like definitions and how we identify these things and how we perceive them.
Yes. And I feel it's like it circles back to this question that we were talking about at the beginning, where it's sort of, what is the moral reading that we use with the label, where natural and, carries this incredible cachet that artificial doesn't. And it sort of, I think, offers us a vocabulary to sort of interpret what we're tasting or what we're experiencing in terms of the flavor. And one of the really interesting things to come out of that was to, again, sort of think about flavor being dynamic and not being static. And that some of the flavors that we're tasting, for example, in things like banana flavored Laffy Taffy, are sort of these historical heirloom flavors. And to think about flavor being an artifact. And that was a new way for me to think about something like flavor.
Oh, that's so interesting. And yeah, it is I don't know. I guess probably everybody listening to the show, no matter what country they're living in, no matter what their, cultural kind of packaging looks like, or the sweets that they grew up with, the nostalgia that they bring up in their minds. I think we all have this kind of experience of like, oh, the fake cherry is my favorite, but I don't actually like cherries. And then like, I like grapes, but fake grape is disgusting, or whatever, your version of that is. There's like a candy version of every flavor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then there's the joke that like, what flavor is that? Blue?
Yeah, it feels like there's a lot of that. And certainly when I was diving into the world of sort of creating these flavors and doing interviews with folks like at Jelly Belly and stuff like that, it was this question of how do you create a flavor for some of these really outrageous things that you never really thought about having a flavor. So, for example, looking at Jelly Belly does these lines of jelly beans that are just truly atrocious. They're, these disgusting flavors that I was introduced thanks to my middle school nephew. And they're everything from like, sweaty socks to vomit flavored. And at that point, I just remember sort of working with the interviewees and talking with the folks at Jelly Belly. And it was sort of like, how do you capture a flavor of something that we don't really think about having a flavor like sweaty socks? And it was really interesting to sort of say, but we're still taking this as a, it's not a synthetic thing. And it again sort of felt like it was an example that cross-cut all of these different categories that we inscribe around different objects.
Yeah, it's like there's still an expectation, even if it's not something that we've ever experienced, I guess,
Right?
because we have the scent, and that's such a big part of flavor, or we have
Right.
like a memory, or we develop these expectations. And it's pretty interesting, these scientists who work in product development, how good they are at understanding, and obviously they focus group a lot of this stuff too, but how good they are at understanding when something is contrary to expectation, even if it's actually a better approximation of quote unquote reality. If it's contrary to expectation, it's not going to sell.
Yes, and that there's this sort of almost platonic ideal of this is what a strawberry ought to taste like, and so we need to make sure that it's meeting those expectations, those consumer expectations for strawberry. And again, sort of looking at, but these are things that change over time, depending on agricultural process, depending on different varieties of strawberries, depending on any number of factors. So again, we come back to this idea that realness and authenticity are these dynamic things.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. So it's not just about the actual content, but it's also about like kind of the quality of the content, or not the quality, but like the meaningness of the content.
Sure. It's sort of like, what does it signify to its consumers or to its, the people that interact with it?
Oh my gosh, it's so complicated. And you're right. This is such an existential topic that it's got this like depth to it that you don't realize when you first start to have a conversation, because yeah, how do we know what's really real? How do we know? I mean, I guess there are external qualifications or external markers, like science is a really good one. That's an epistemology that we often use to try and at least discriminate. I think sometimes when we talk about, for example, if somebody's having a hallucination, how do we know that that's a hallucination, or that they are not just perceiving reality in a way that we aren't? And we usually will talk about that there has to be consensus, for example. Multiple people have to appreciate it the same way. Do you think consensus is an important part of reality? But what happens when like everybody has consensus on something that later we find out wasn't real?
So I think that the idea of consensus, though, plays a huge role in sort of in helping those objects move up and down that continuum of authenticity. And as you were describing that, the idea of consensus, what really popped into my head were the stories of laboratory grown diamonds, and whether or not and sort of how do we read laboratory grown diamonds as being quote unquote authentic gems or not. And so in the middle of the 20th century, General Electric is working to create laboratory grown diamonds, and they do this in 1954. And it takes decades for the gem industry to accept laboratory grown diamonds as legitimate, real, authentic, genuine, whatever adjective you want to throw in there. It takes decades for the industry to accept them as anything other than just sort of this poor stand-in, as something to be mocked. Even though on a material level, a laboratory grown diamond and a diamond that's mined from the ground are identical. So it's not a question of sort of materiality, it's a question of cultural meaning. And in the 21st century, what's so interesting to me is that we see a rise in a social consensus and sort of a changing social consensus about what a authentic diamond ought to be. And I think that this is tied to companies like the Diamond Foundry or the Lightbox line of De Beers that are specifically marketing laboratory grown diamonds. And they're doing this particularly in the case of the Diamond Foundry, as an ethical alternative to natural diamonds. And so at that point, this is a really powerful example of changing social mores and social consensus to say, we want something else because we value that something else more than the quote unquote natural diamond.
Man, that's so interesting. And also there's the conversation too about sort of again, going back to the specific content. So it's how are these diamonds produced? That is part of the, I guess, algorithm or the calculus that people have. Were they quote unquote naturally produced, or were they synthetically, or, maybe synthetic isn't the right word there because that actually does have legal connotations, but were they,
they're laboratory diamonds, right? They're laboratory grown diamonds. And so there's this sort of anxiety that, well, it must not be special. If you can just sort of go wave your science wand and create this in a lab, how important is that? What kind of person would put that on a, engagement ring? And so there's all of this sort of social anxiety that gets wrapped up in that, that I think is really an interesting part of that. And certainly in the 1950s and the 1960s, when these diamonds were first starting to sort of make their way out of General Electric. And I should also note that the earliest laboratory grown diamonds were used for industrial purposes. And so it takes a while for them to sort of, cross over into the jewelry world. But professional jewelers and gem experts and appraisers would sort of compare these laboratory grown diamonds to, what was one of my favorite ones? It was to fishing in a stock pond. That, there's no sport to it. It's all just this artifice, and there's no sort of thrill to the hunt of it. And that was, I think, a really powerful sort of social marker in the mid 20th century to align, authentic gems with this idea that they have to be mined and they have to come from nature. And anything that's not coming from nature is just this sort of artificial, deceptive thing.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Yeah, which of course, like on the SGU, we talk a lot about informal logical fallacies, and we actually talk about this this fallacy, basically, that if something came from nature, it is somehow better, or it is somehow safer, or it is somehow more desirable. And that's actually an informal logical fallacy, because we see it all the time in biomedical science. We see it, I think GMOs obviously are one of the most perfect examples. When you ask people who have a strong negative opinion about genetically modified organisms, that's often based on emotion, not based on the research, their number one answer is, well, it's just not natural.
Yeah, if only agriculture, worked that way.
Yeah, exactly. And it really does show.
That was really snide. I'm sorry.
It's important. It's an important conversation to be had, right? Because it's that kind of difference between something was natural or something is artificial. And of course, when it comes to GMOs, it gets extra complicated, because this idea of something being synthetic is actually a legal conversation. And that's totally different than natural.
we start seeing these questions of what terminology can be applied to diamonds. And so it's really the story, I think, of GMOs and foods and diamonds are actually a lot closer than I would have expected before I dove into the research and writing of the book, and sort of the legal repercussions for what you can call what gets to be a diamond, or what gets to be a diamond under what kinds of circumstances, I think are things that are sort of right now at the forefront of being hashed out with this question.
Oh, it's fascinating. And like I was saying, you've got this kind of algorithm that I think a lot of people start to develop, maybe subconsciously in their minds, that, okay, number one, is it real, quote unquote, or is it
Yeah,
natural, or does it feel authentic? But number two, is it something that I can feel good about? Am I voting with my dollar? Am I making the ethical,
yeah,
conscientious choice? And that's where we really saw the flip. But there's also a third kind of component to this, which is sort of how flawed is it? And I think some people like something that has a few flaws because it makes it feel like it's been loved, or it makes it feel like going back to that first component, it's more quote unquote natural. But other people are like, I want my shit to be perfect. And a lab grown diamond is probably more perfect. And so that's
yeah.
weird too.
It again sort of has all of these points that go into the axes of how do we think about authenticity. And again, it sort of comes back to the as a material object, it doesn't stop existing just because we've passed this judgment on it once. And so I would venture to guess that, what we saw of laboratory grown diamonds in the 1950s is different than what we saw in the 1990s, is different than the sort of 2010s here. And I would venture to guess that in 20 years, the story of laboratory grown diamonds will have a different sort of reading of its authenticity.
Well, and see, this is what I love so much about, having the opportunity to sit down with different individuals on my show who bring their expertise and their perspective to their work. Because and we haven't really talked about this yet in this episode, although we did in the last episode you were on, you are a historian. And so that lens is going to travel with you when you start to tell these stories. And I love that so much because I think so often we forget that there's this rich timeline of, like you said, changing, adapting, evolving information. We're so often fixed at looking at the world through the perspective and the lens that's happening right now. And we don't always connect the dots between then, now, in the future, and all the iterations in between. But you are able to tell that super rich story. It's obviously a lot more work for you. What drives you to keep doing it and keep digging and try and keep saying, okay, but maybe that's how it was in 1956, but what was it like in 1967?
Yeah, I think it's because it is so interesting to me to sort of treat the objects as having their own biographies. And I think that this approach was one that I really ended up honing with Seven Skeletons, to sort of treat a fossil as having a biography. And then here in Genuine Fakes, to treat each of these different genuine fakes as having their own sort of life history, and sort of feeling like it's part of my job as a historian and as a writer to sort of introduce readers to that life history. And I think paired with that life history of the different objects is a sense that we are not the first people to ask these questions. The people in the past also wanted to know about authenticity and wanted to know about realness. And sort of all of these questions that we're grappling with, these are questions that people in the past grappled with as well about some of these very same objects. And I think that really is interesting.
When I read your biography, that makes a little more sense. You're often referred to, right, as a historian of science, but also I see this kind of blurb that you're interested in the history, science, and material culture, which is such a kind of fascinating focal point. Material culture. What does that really mean? Like our interaction with objects?
Yes, I think it's a term that generally ends up being tied to disciplines like archaeology or anthropology. And it's looking at objects that we interact with, objects that we make, objects that are important to us, And I really like the idea of using these objects as a way to unpack decisions that we've made about value in the past. So a thing looks a certain way because people made decisions about how to shape that thing. And understanding those decisions, I feel like helps us understand the complexity of the objects, but also the complexity of the culture and society that surround those objects.
So, when you started to approach the book, is that how you organized your thoughts? Were you like, I'm going to focus on a bunch of different objects and use these objects as sort of stories to tell about our relationship with authenticity? Or, like, how did you choose which things you wanted to focus on? And is everything in the book a physical object, or are some of them just ideas or constructs?
That's a really good question, actually. And I think that at one iteration of this project, I think I had something like 25 or 30 different index cards up on a wall, and there was string, and it was all very complicated. And it was like, oh, everything's connected and everything's fake, and I must write about everything. And I sent a picture of this to my editor, and he just said, I don't think that that's really going to work. So why don't you pick a couple? It was very nice. It was very kind. And so I focused on 8 what I see as objects that really I felt like were difficult ones to answer. The question of authenticity wasn't very clear cut. And so with the 8 different objects, I also tried to pick ones that I felt like stood in their own specific kinds of categories, whether it's a fake thing that's made out of real stuff, or whether it's, something that becomes valuable after it's been debunked as a fake. All of these different ways that we could read real and fake and authentic. And because I wanted to introduce people to these different categories of thinking about authenticity, with the idea being that, I read this story of Walrus Cam, and that's just like this other thing that I'm thinking of. And to sort of use these as vehicles for readers to be able to explore the concepts on their own. But it was very hard to pick only 8, I will say.
Oh, I can imagine. Like, with such a because literally this is one of those difficult things when you choose to tell the kinds of stories that you tell. Like, even with your first book, was Skeletons your first book?
It was actually my second.
Oh, good. Okay. So even with your second book, the first one that I had you on the show to talk about, Seven Skeletons,
yes.
And that has a finite, like, there are only so many paleoanthropological specimens, but there's still a wealth within those constraints. But for this book, for Genuine Fakes, it's unbounded. Literally, there is no end to what you could have chosen to talk about. It must have been so difficult to narrow in. Did you use the help of your editor? Like, how did you actually finally make that ultimate decision? And did you end up writing extra chapters, quote unquote, just in case? I'm like, you're a writer. I know you.
Yes, there is a file folder on my desktop that says, must write these chapters and must include this. They will find a home eventually. So one of the big things that I used to make the cuts about what would be included in Genuine Fakes and what wouldn't was whether there was a material thing. And I felt like it's an arbitrary decision, but it was a decision that I could make to really focus on the material life of objects. And I also felt like it was a way of emphasizing that this book wasn't about fake news. That it's a book about how we think about the word fake and how we use the word fake, but it was a way of not ending up writing a book about propaganda or fake news. And so there was very much that conscious decision from the get-go. And then again, the question of, what ones do I talk about? What ones do I not? I cut a chapter, for example, about imitation leather, because I felt like a lot of the same thematic questions were asked and answered with the chapter on laboratory grown diamonds. And my hope was, this is an example where changing social mores and ethics sort of ask us to think about authenticity a different way. I think that readers would make that leap. And so those were the sorts of categories and criteria that I used to pick the ones that I did.
Gotcha. Because, yeah, each chapter is both about the object, but also about our relationship with that kind of idea. And so, if you're starting to maybe just have separate examples, then they're going to feel redundant. And of course, then you can always mention them in passing without dedicating a whole chapter to them.
That was finally the decision process I had to go through.
Oh, yeah, that must have been still really hard because, of course, they talk about, right, like killing your darlings or whatever.
Oh
Like,
my
it's,
goodness. No,
yeah,
I
this is
don't. I
not
just put them in a
gentle.
file folder on my desktop.
They shall never die.
Exactly.
I kind of want to get back to the art thing a little because I think we used it at the beginning as a an intro, but we didn't really flesh it out heavily. You know, when I think about the complicated relationship with authenticity, um, Warhol is such a great example, and it's an example that you use in the book. And I want to come back to Warhol, but I think one of the first things that my mind went to, and maybe this is why I'm not a writer, because it's unclear still how I would ever flesh this out, is I think a little bit about Banksy. And I think about how people love Banksy, but also it's this idea of like anti art and it's street art, and then, you know, public art and destroying the art or wanting to sell individual authentic Banksys as fakes and seeing it's like this big social experiment on top of being an art movement.
Yes.
Everybody
It's all of this subversion
Yes,
that goes
thank
into
you.
it.
Yes, that's such a perfect word for it. And I don't know if everybody remembers the recent Banksy where they were selling it. Was it at Christie's or something? And then it like shredded itself and then everybody lost their minds. But then it's like, does that make it actually more desirable because it was an intentional, again, subversion of this concept? I don't know. It's my brain is about to explode even thinking about it.
Right. And so sort of all of the points that you bring up here are the reasons that I included the Banksy piece in the conclusion of the book. And the Banksy piece that I included was Peckham Rock, which is this sort of a rogue installation that he does in the British Museum in 2005. And it's this sort of piece of cement looking thing with this sort of shopping cart in this human like form that's on it. And it lasts, a couple of days in the British Museum before it's unceremoniously taken down and sort of returned. And nobody really wants to talk about it. And where it becomes so interesting is that in 2018, the British Museum puts together an exhibition called I Object, and they collect 100 subversive objects from the museum's history. And one of the objects that they put on exhibition is Banksy's Peckham Rock. And so they have to ask for it back, which is funny. And then I also loved seeing the piece there at the exhibition where you had it remounted on a wall and you had the original fake label. And next to the original fake label that he used in 2005, there's a contemporary 2018 label that's explaining the entire context, sort of explaining the joke and explaining what the piece had done. And I loved the idea that here it's something that's in the museum, then it's out of the museum. And then here we are, we're moving it back on this continuum of authenticity and putting it back in the museum to sort of offer this other kind of context. And so I feel like the art like that is such a great example of looking at how the social context that surrounds it shapes how we think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I don't know. We actually have a museum. Have you come to LA and visited the Museum of Jurassic Technology?
I have. It's been a long time, but I have.
And so it's got this kind of strange relationship with reality as well, right? This idea that these are sort of, what do they call it? They call itself, quote, an educational institution dedicated to the advancement of knowledge and the public appreciation of the lower Jurassic. And it's really just a bunch of weird historical unclassified stuff that is all obviously not credible. But it's like intentionally not credible to kind of, I think, I don't know, like strain people's concept of what is real and what, because so much, I guess, especially in a museum, so much trust is put in the provenance because of that little piece of paper.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's exactly sort of what Banksy is trying to encourage people to think about of, how do we trust? What are the institutions of this trust? And what do these institutions, have to say about the trust that's put in them? And I think that it's fantastic to sort of see the story replayed out, but with a different conclusion there in 2018. That was really fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like, I don't know, I'm always looking for parallels in my head, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But like in neuroscience, for example, one of the kind of best ways, or maybe I should say in medicine in general, biomedical science, one of the ways that we work so hard to understand sort of quote typical, right? We've sort of gotten away from using the word normal and maybe moving more into typical functionality is to study examples of when things go awry and to study examples of when things go wrong. So we know so much about memory because we've had the opportunity to study individuals who had a certain type of brain damage that actually impaired their memory. And then that's how we have a better understanding of what a functional memory looks like. And it's so interesting that sometimes we really take so much of just what is for granted until we appreciate a subversion of what is.
Yeah. No, I think so. And I think that it also speaks, you were talking about sort of art broadly before. I think it also speaks to the idea of sort of the fear of being duped, and that plays a lot of, I think that plays a huge role in sort of the passing judgment about fake, is that it's not so much just a label and a judgment, but it's also sort of an anxiety that maybe I'm being fooled, maybe I'm being deceived, maybe I'm being tricked. And I think that sort of goes back to this question of how fake has such a bad connotation.
Yeah, that's kind of something we hadn't even really talked about yet, but it's so important to the conversation is the psychological experience of being quote, victimized by a fake. And you're right, it's a very negative emotion that's tied to that. Like the shame and the embarrassment and the sadness and the betrayal and all these really really dark emotions are tied to the feeling of having been lied to, having been tricked, having been, especially when it's done in poor faith versus in good faith, right? Because we've also subverted that Halloween and trick or treat and horror movies, and when we're in on the joke, then we're happy with it.
Right, and the really great story I think that was fun to explore with that is the story of the Spanish forger who's at the turn of the 20th century is an artist that is cranking out all of these sort of faux medieval paintings and panels and pages and miniatures, and he's incredibly successful. He or she is incredibly successful about all of these fakes until 1930, when Belle de Costa Green, who's the librarian and scholar at the J.P. Morgan library, sort of uncovers the Spanish forger as a forger, and she's looking and going through all of these paintings. She's working specifically with a painting called The Betrothal of Saint Ursula. And she's looking at this and it just looks too good to be true. It's just too medieval looking. And so that's sort of what tips the scales for her in sort of putting this on as a forgery. And as she goes back through different collections, and so rather than sort of feel had or sad or all of these other things, she sort of becomes like armed with this of, aha, I must root out all of these examples of the Spanish forger in different collections. And so over the course of her life, she begins to catalog all of these different examples of Spanish forger paintings that either come up for auction or that are in different collections. But part of the story of the Spanish forger that I loved is we still don't have a name. We don't have a name. We don't have a gender. We don't have an identity. It's this incredibly successful forger that we know very little about.
Ooh, and doesn't that always just make everything so much more intriguing? Like it's
Yes.
intriguing enough to know about a person, like, ooh, this person who was like this,
Right.
rogue, whatever. But then it's like even more intriguing when that person is still, I don't know, shaded.
It's just unknown.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It sort of has all of these different possibilities, and I think that that's part of the sort of social connection and the sort of excitement that we have about wanting to hear about stories that are about fakes and frauds and forgers.
Ugh, I love that so much. So Lydia, I think one of the things that I want to know from you, I think that might be kind of help me understand how you went about making this book and how you've gone about kind of doing the popular sort of history of science, or it's actually broader than history of science, that you've really made this interesting niche in your work. Um, we talked a little bit about Piltdown Man from Seven Skeletons kind of inspiring a transition into genuine fakes. But just in general, as a science historian, like is this like a thing? Is this a a departmental thing when you go to a university? Is this something you can study for? Like it's so
Yes.
interesting and so specific, but you're also the only person I've ever met who does this.
Oh my goodness. So to answer your question, absolutely. History of science, history and philosophy of science are definitely topics, department field topics, fields of study, all of these sorts of great things. There's also a parallel track of academic study called science and technology studies that's a little bit more sort of socially interested, sort of what how is science done socially, and what are the sort of social makings of knowledge, and all of those sorts of cool
Really?
questions. Yes, science and technology studies, STS is how it's abbreviated.
Why didn't I? Because obviously I'm well aware that there are many science historians, but I'm so used to them being like kind of like Kuhnian, like maybe more philosophers and talking about sort of
Right.
ideas and talking about, maybe being biographers of scientists and things like that. But that's not really what you do.
No, and history of science and science and technology studies are all about the sort of different ways that people have engaged with science in the past. Whether that's through objects, whether that's through experiments, whether it's through sort of schools of scientific inquiry, whether it's through the scientists themselves. There are a lot of different ways that people have academically engaged with that. And there are departments all across the world that are history of science departments.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, that's really good to know. And there's so many like potential, I guess, tracks or outcomes of doing this kind of study. Like I never would have drawn a straight line between history of science and like the really cool stuff that you write about. And I guess if you pressed me to say, what do you think she studied in school or what do you think she does? But isn't a lot of your education in anthropology?
It is in anthropology and archaeology more specifically. And so I think that for myself is really where I got a good grounding about the power and the sort of the social cachet that different artifacts can have and what you can know about people based on the material things that are left behind. And so I think that it's that combination of a background in archaeology and a background in history of science that have really come together to let me be able to dive into these really interesting and diverse projects.
And so are you still kind of connected to the academic world, or has writing become sort of your, especially the popular science writing, so it's much more like maybe on the science communication side of things or the public appreciation side of things. Has that become kind of your whole world, or do you still maintain an academic foot?
So I have a academic affiliation with the University of Texas at Austin. I'm a visiting researcher at the Institute for Historical Studies, which is very cool. But I don't I'm not sort of tied to an academic university the way a tenure track researcher would be. That my affiliation, my career really is that of a writer.
I love that. And so when you first, were studying, had you always been writing? Did you write before you got your PhD, or is it something that you really found a love for after you kind of went through the traditional academic rigmarole?
Probably both, I would say. That I definitely started out graduate school with an idea that I would love to write and to be a writer. I think I'm very fortunate in that. My dad is actually a writer. And so I think growing up with this idea of, oh, people write books and these are cool projects that you can do as a writer, I think was hugely influential. But certainly, I think in graduate school, I came away with a sense that I was interested in writing these sorts of exploratory projects that didn't necessarily lend themselves to really specific tenure track sorts of niches.
And so, because your affiliation with the university is not kind of a more traditional one. I mean, I even hate making these categories of like, what is traditional academia? Because I'm all
Yeah,
about
exactly. No,
non-traditional
exactly.
relationships.
But for example, I don't teach, and that's usually like that's a pretty easy sort of dividing line. I don't teach. I do a couple of seminars every once in a while for graduate students that are interested in writing. Sort of, what does it mean to take a background in history and to be a writer? Those sorts of things, and that's very cool. And certainly, the academic affiliation is helpful in the research that I do in being able to access. Libraries and archives and sources that wouldn't be available, I think, or would be much more difficult to access without that. And so I'm very grateful to be able to sort of bridge both with that.
And so being able to sometimes do that, that means that you do have, that interaction with students. Have you found that there are sort of young academics who are like inspired by the really interesting work that you do and want to kind of like, I don't know, continue that conversation?
That would be super cool. I have had different students reach out, and that's cool. After doing a lecture or something like that, of this is so cool. What did you do, or how did you get to this kind of career path? And that's always fun to talk about, especially because I think for writing there are a plethora of different ways that if that's what you want to do, there are a plethora of different ways to get there, and so that's fun to talk to students about.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where, kind of the younger generations are starting to realize that like the freelance lifestyle, it has to be a viable option for them because although there are still some kind of traditional quote unquote ways to have a career, the economy is just different now, and like the way that we have to secure our future is different now. So, a lot of people have become freelancers and they are interested in wearing multiple hats, and I think we're starting to realize too that that question has become a really important question for young people, especially those who are going through kind of the academic hurdles, which is like, how do I become a you? Like, is there like a checklist? Because it's just, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to get the job at the corporation, I'm going to like work there for 40 years, then I'm going to leave with a pension. It just doesn't happen that often anymore.
That sounds very quaint when you put it like that.
But yeah, how do I become a you? I think has become a very common question that, a lot of my friends who work in this field, whatever that means, have to answer. I've had to answer that question. People come to you about that question, and it's a hard question to answer.
It is because it feels very capricious on some level that, here, there are a set of circumstances and I was fortunate and I took X instead of Y, or I did X instead of Y. But for myself, one of the things that I have been the most grateful for in my career as a writer is to have the grounding in how to do research that graduate school did teach me and did afford me. And so, regardless of whether I'm working on a short freelance piece for a publication or whether I'm diving into a bigger book project like this, I know that training in how to do research and how to find sources and how to fact check things has been invaluable.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of that really is very kind of transferable, and that's important for sure. So Lydia, I don't want to keep you for too long today. I honestly could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but also I don't want to give away everything in the book because it's such a great read. It's such a fast read. It's like a page turner, and I want everybody to have.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I want everybody to have the opportunity to go, what happens next? Without us telling you. So, but before we go, I do, you probably remember, but I always ask my guests the same two questions at the end of the show. Um, and I would be interested to see, just like our concept of what is real and what is fake changes over time, I'd be interested to see if your answers have changed over the last 3 years since you came on the show. So, yeah, I would love to know from you, when you look at the future, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night and, concerns you the most? And on the flip side of that, what is the thing that you are genuinely excited and optimistic for?
Wow, those are big questions. And I completely did not remember that you asked those. They're great questions, though. But there's just this note where I'm just like, how can I not remember that she ends with those questions?
You blocked it out is what you did. You were like, that was painful.
All right. So things that I am the most concerned about. And I would say that especially coming out of a project like Genuine Fakes, I would say that I'm concerned about how flip we are about being quick to label things and to dismiss them. And sort of how we've talked about the word fake being more than just a label or a judgment or a dismissal. I would be concerned that people aren't willing to unpack the complexity and the nuance of things. And that's probably a historical truism. I'm sure that people have been concerned about that, for millennia. But I would echo that certainly in the work that I've done with Genuine Fakes, I would say that all of these things are much more complicated than we might first think of, and that there's value in recognizing that complexity.
Yeah, and there's this interesting component to it that you have to have the insight. It's almost like a Dunning-Kruger situation. Like you have to have the insight to know to dig deeper, to find the complexity, to be able to dig deeper and find the complexity. And so it makes sense that it's so seldom done, that we so seldom actually take the time to do it and to see the nuance and complexity, because by virtue of having the insight to do or lacking the insight to do it, we never would go through and do that.
Exactly. But I would say on the flip side, the thing that I'm the most excited about, especially coming out of this project, is finding examples where people are more willing to be flexible and to expand the definition of what authenticity is and what gets to count as an authentic object. And I come back to objects like the laboratory grown diamonds or the Impossible Burger or any other number of things that we here in the 21st century are replicating and working to copy, and for any number of reasons. And to see the definition of what gets to count as authentic expand is very exciting.
Yeah. Oh gosh, Lydia, this was such a really fun chat. I was super excited when I first heard that you had a new book. I was super excited that we were going to be able to get together, and you did not disappoint.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for your time. It's always so much fun to chat with you.
Absolutely. I always learn so much from you. Guys, the book is Genuine Fakes, How Phony Things Teach Us About Real Stuff. Pick it up right now. You will not regret it, I promise. So, Lydia, thank you for joining me. And everybody else, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.